Now that we have seen overview of the application flow, let's understand pipeline and middleware in detail. So whenever an HTTP request comes in, something must handle that request, so it eventually results in a HTTP response. Those pieces of code that handle request and results in a response make up the request pipeline. What we can do is configure this request pipeline by adding middleware, which are software components that are assembled into an application pipeline to handle request and response. So typically a browser is going to send a request to your server, and that request is then going to be interpreted by the server and handled by some piece of software. Now first, that request is attached to something called as context object. As a part of software that manages this context, in our case it would be ASP.NET Core middleware. And as you can essentially think of it as a pipeline, as a series of pipes that is going to determine what should happen to the context. So first, the request is going to pass along the first pipe, and the first pipe interprets the context and checks out the request. It also checks if there is any response that needed to be added to the context. If there is no immediate response that should hand back to the server, then the context is simply passed along to the next pipe in the pipeline. This continues again to the next piece of middleware, whatever it might be, and it goes on until it reaches the very last pipe. Now it is also possible that at the end of pipeline, no response has been formed, and that will cause a 404 not found and return back to whoever originated the request. However, it is also possible that in any one or more of these middleware, there may be a response that needs to be passed back, and it could happen in any of these pipes. So sometimes it could happen that the middleware would not pass the context along the next pipe, but rather it says, okay, I have a response that I need to send back. But typically your context will go all the way through the pipeline to the end, where the last piece of middleware sends a response which gets sent back through the pipeline to the server, and then the server just sends back response object back to the browser. This is very simplified version of how the request works. So when the request comes into the server then accesses the core framework and puts the request into the context. The context gets passed along the middleware, and if the middleware has a response along the way, then it will attach that response to the context object and then pass that context object back through the pipeline to the server, and then the server sends the response back to the browser. Now keep in mind the order of pipeline is very important. It is always passed from the first to the last. A good example would be authentication middleware. If the middleware component finds that the request isn't authorized, it should not pass to the next middleware, but it will automatically return an unauthorized response. It is hence important that the authentication middleware is added before the other components like MVC, and that shouldn't be triggered in case of an unauthorized request. A few examples of middleware are diagnostics middleware or middleware to handle authentication, and even MVC itself is a piece of middleware. Now let's take a look at Visual Studio files and see how this works. So right here we are inside the startup class file, and we have the configure services where we will be adding all the methods or all the services that we want to use. Then in the configure method we will call all of those services. Now inside the configure method, the first thing you see is we are checking if we are in the development environment, and then we can see app.useDeveloper exception page middleware. This middleware will typically show you exception which is developer friendly, so that when you're developing you can debug the application much simpler if in case there is an exception. In the else part you have the use exception handler, and it just gives an error message like error string. You can customize this and you can point it to show a nice page if in case there is an error or an exception. And as we know that we can see in the project properties that we can add multiple environment. So based on that environment, it will automatically detect what is the current environment and work accordingly. Now, in order to use this environment, we have to use the iHosting environment service, which will provide the core abstraction for working with environments. It is provided by the ASP.NET hosting layer and can be injected, and we can see that it is already injected inside the configure method. We also have other middlewares like use HTTPS redirection and use static files, use cookies policy, because by default in the project it shows that you have to accept the cookies for the website. And finally, we have the app.useMVC middlewares. So this is where you can see that if you add anything in future, like let's say you want to add identity, you want to use entity framework, then you'll have to add those middlewares as we proceed. Another good example of a middleware is authorization, and we will take a look at all of them as we proceed throughout the course.